Good morning. It is Friday, January the 28th, and this is The Drill. Welcome to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. I'm Ron, your host and the only true conservative in the United States today. So today, after the Daily Declaration for Spiritual Warfare, the Pledge of Allegiance, and the Star-Spangled Banner, we will have There's No Free Lunch and How We Got Here, the 70s. The chapter is called Satan's Spawn. All that and more when I get back. Thank you. And now the Daily Declaration for Spiritual Warfare for January 28th. My kingdom will be established in your life. My kingdom come, my will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. My kingdom will advance and be established through the preaching and teaching of my word, and through my miracles of healing. Let the gates of your life and city be open for the King of glory to come in. I am robed in majesty and armed with strength. Indeed, the whole world is established, firm and secure, because my throne was established long ago, from all eternity. Do not be afraid, little one, for it has pleased me to give you the kingdom. Let men know of my mighty acts and the glorious majesty of my kingdom. Let the kingdoms of this world become the kingdoms of my Son, Jesus Christ. Matthew chapter 4, verse 23, Psalms chapter 24, verse 7, chapter 103, verses 19 through 22, and Psalms 145, verse 12. And that, prayer declaration. Your kingdom come, Lord, your will be done, Lord. You reign. You are clothed with majesty and strength. Your throne is established of old. You are from everlasting. I receive the kingdom because it is your good pleasure to give it to me. Let me speak of the glory of your kingdom and talk of your power. And that was the Daily Declaration for Spiritual Warfare for January 28th. Thank you. Ineffable Creator, who out of the treasures of thy wisdom has appointed 3 hierarchies of angels and set them in admirable order high above the heavens, and has disposed the divers portion of the universe in such marvelous array. Thou who art called the true source of light and supereminent principle of wisdom, be pleased to cast a beam of thy radiance upon the darkness of my mind and dispel me from the double darkness of sin and ignorance in which I have been born. Thou who makest eloquent the tongues of little children, fashion my words and pour upon my lips the grace of thy benediction. Grant me penetration to understand, capacity to retain, method and facility in study, subtlety in interpretation, and abundant grace of expression. Order the beginning, direct the progress, and perfect the achievement of my work. Thou who art true God and man, and livest and reignest forever and ever. Amen. Who is the true conservative? The true conservative is the person that understands that conservatism is not just about politics, but culture as well. He's the person that knows that there is no leadership in a constitutional republic. He acts like an adult. He is patriotic and uses common sense. He makes judgments, refuses to speculate, speaks clearly and definitively, and is not afraid to say no. He's open-minded, asking why rather than why not. He is consistent, credible, and influential, not ashamed of his existence, unafraid to learn or correct his mistakes. He is a normal American. Thank you. And now there's no free lunch. Human civilization is not something achieved against nature. It is rather the outcome of the working of the innate qualities of man. Ludwig von Mises. I can summarize what economics is this way. Man was made in the image of God, with properties of independence, creativity, aspiration, and self-preservation. The actions of man as created beings reflect man's internal qualities, and in the aggregate form, civilizations. Human action is economics, and economics is human action. At the root of economics will always be the human person, not a mathematical model. Indeed, at the root of civilization will always be the failures and triumphs of mankind. And that was there's no free lunch. Thank you. And now, Satan's spawn. Think of all those old movies in which a beautiful young wife looks up at her husband with dewy eyes and says, "Darling, I have some wonderful news." In the movies of the 1970s, pregnancy is not so happy. Actress after actress discovers that the child she is carrying is quite literally satanic. In Rosemary's Baby, a pregnant Mia Farrow learns that the baby she's carrying is the Antichrist. In The Omen, Gregory Peck and Lee Remick make the same dreadful discovery about their child. Monster babies drive the plot of the 1970s cult classic, It's Alive. And of course, a demonic child was the star of one of the decade's most hugely successful movies, The Exorcist. It's hard to remember an era when American popular culture was as nervous of children as in the 1970s. The protagonists of all the most successful situation comedies of the 1970s, The Mary Tyler Moore Show, The Bob Newhart Show, Rhoda, The Jeffersons, Three's Company, were cast as childless. The exceptions proved the rule. All in the Family's Gloria announced her pregnancy in the show's 110th episode in an attempt to perk up ratings. B. Arthur's Maude had a grown-up daughter, but as if to make up for it, Maude herself had an abortion. With tens of millions of baby boomer women entering the peak fertility years, statisticians expected a follow-on boomlet beginning in the middle 1970s. Instead, the number of 20-something women rose and rose, while the number of births dropped and dropped. Fewer babies were born in 1971 than in 1970. Fewer in 1972 than in 1971. Fewer in 1973 than in 1972. The number of births hit bottom in 1974 when just 3.1 million babies were born, down from 4.3 million in 1957. 18 New York City hospitals closed their maternity wards in the early 1970s. The total U.S. birth rate plunged to the lowest level seen since the 1930s to half the level that prevailed in the 1950s. People bear fewer children in economically troubled times, but the Americans of the 1970s did not merely postpone children as the Americans of the 1930s did. They actually changed their minds about wanting them. In 1945, half of all adult Americans thought the ideal family contained 4 or more children. As late as 1967, 40% of Americans and 45% of American women thought that 4 or more was the ideal family. 6 years later, in 1973, only 20% of American adults and only 12% of college-educated women thought that 4 or more children was the ideal. A majority of Americans thought 2 children ideal in 1980. Back in 1936, only 29% would have been content with 2. The Americans most immune to the economic woes of the 1970s actually turned against childbearing most strongly. In 1971, Upper Crust Bryn Mawr conducted a survey of the college's 5 most recent graduating classes, 1966, 67, 68, 69, and 70. About 3/4 of the alumni participated. They reported giving birth to more than 70 babies. In 1975, the college repeated the survey of recent graduates, 1971, 72, 73, 74, 75. Again, 3/4 of the alumni responded. This time, they reported a grand total of 3 babies. Abortion and birth control are obviously part of the explanation of the baby bust, but only a part. New York State liberalized its abortion law in 1970, and other states soon followed. The U.S. Supreme Court handed down Roe v. Wade in January 1973, which recognized abortion as a federal constitutional right. Abortion, once a crime so dreadful as to verge on the unmentionable, edged toward the center of sexual life. In 1975, federal statisticians counted 272 abortions for every 1,000 live births. In 1976, they counted 312. New York City recorded 676 abortions for every 1,000 births in 1976. In Washington, D.C., the number of abortions actually equaled the number of live births. From the late 1970s until the mid-1990s, the number of abortions in the United States seldom dipped below the 1.5 million mark. Back in a minute. Thank you. Nevertheless, it would be a big mistake to seek a technological explanation for the crash in the birth rate. The women of the 1950s and early 60s had big families not because they lacked the means to control their fertility. In that case, they would have been born 9 or 14 children apiece rather than 3 or 4, but because they wanted big families. Married women had ready access to diaphragms, and even unmarried women could get them with only little trouble. The 1879 Connecticut statute overturned by Griswold had not yet been enforced in decades. The birth control pill appeared on the market in 1961, a decade before the birth rate plunged. It was women's preferences, not contraceptive techniques, that changed in the 1970s. The women of the 1970s wanted small families of 10. They wanted no family of all. And only 50% of non-college young women and only 35% of college-educated young women regarded having children as very important in 1973. These women were unenthusiastic about children because they believed, perfectly correctly, that children would inhibit their freedom and compromise their individuality. Motherhood, who needs it? Demanded Betty Rollins in a famous 1970 article in Look. Even the most adorable children make for additional demands, complications, and hardships in the lives of even the most loving parents. Theologian Rosemary Radford Ruther argued in her 1975 book, New Women, New Earth, each generation of women has been sacrificed to its own children. History has been the Holocaust of women. It was past time, she and others felt, for the Holocaust to end. The adults of the 1970s were adamant. Their needs came first. The truest single detail in a film packed with reminiscences of 1970s daily life, The Ice Storm, was the middle-class dinner party at which the children carried and cleared plates for their parents' friends. In 1973, it would have seemed excruciatingly pretentious to hire a tuxedoed waiter to serve dinner in a private home, and shockingly retrograde for the woman of the house to do it. The solution, almost unthinkable in the child-obsessed 1990s, was to assign the task to the kids. If a mother has a life of her own, the daughter will love her more, will want to be around her more, promised Nancy Friday in her 1977 bestseller, My Mother, Myself. She must not define herself as a mother. She's got to see herself as a person with work to do, a sexual person, a woman. It isn't necessary to have a profession. She doesn't have to have a high IQ or be president of the PTA to have this added life. So long as she isn't just sitting home, chauffeuring the kids and baking cookies, giving her children and herself the feeling that their life is hers. Wayne Dyer advised, if you make your children more important than yourself, then you're not helping them, you're merely teaching them to put others ahead of themselves and to take a back seat while remaining unfulfilled. Only by treating yourself as the most important person and not always sacrificing yourself for your children will you teach them to have their own self-confidence and believe in themselves. This teaching found its audience. By late 1970, 66% of American adults surveyed agreed with the statement, parents should be free to live their own lives, even if it means spending less time with their children. Leaving the care of one's children to others became a test of one's commitment to female independence and equality. Easing the burdens of motherhood and supporting abortion reform are essential tasks, yet they both imply a continuation of a powerless female responsibility for children and for birth control, complained the feminist writer Phyllis Chesler. The National Opinion Research Center found in 1977 that 55% of women agreed that a working mother can establish just as secure and warm a relationship with her child as a mother who does not work. By 1985, 67% of women agreed. Back in a minute. Thank you. In the past, working women had endeavored to place their children in the care of a relative, typically their own mothers. That sense that children whose mothers worked ought at least to be cared for in the family was fading. In 1977, only 13% of the children of working mothers attended daycare centers. By 1985, centers took care of 23% of the children of a much larger cohort of working mothers. President Nixon vetoed a comprehensive national daycare plan in 1971, but his view that child care was a family responsibility was already obsolete. It was every bit as important to put oneself first in one's intimate life as in one's work life. No marriage should be sustained for the sake of the children, urged a popular divorce book. Once the divorce had occurred, there was no reason to be bashful about one's sexuality. In my clinical practice, I found that those single parents who feel good about themselves and have a healthy respect for their own needs are best equipped to be good parents, cooed Mary Mattis, a psychologist who had spent the 1970s counseling divorced women. Parents must encourage their children, she continued, to understand a parent's needs. She offered a helpful example of how best to do that. A 12-year-old boy barged into his mother's bedroom in mid-afternoon to tell her about his big score in a Little League game. This propensity of children to pop up when they're least wanted inspired one of the most characteristic inventions of the 1970s, the adults-only condominium complex. He interrupted the mother grappling with her new boyfriend. The son ran out furious. The mother dressed and caught up with him to impart the decade's new wisdom. Just as she respected his closed door when she suspected he was masturbating, she said she expected him to respect her closed door. This, the psychologist claimed, calmed the boy. He asked, "Are you going to have sex again now?" "Probably not. You know how it is. You can't always get back into masturbating if I've just left the room, can you?" "We'll probably want to be alone together after bedtime. What are you planning to do now?" "I was going to ask if I could go and play with Roger. His mom said I could stay for supper if I liked hamburgers." And the boy walked happily off to his friend's house, proving that Hamlet might have had a happier ending if only Gertrude had mastered modern communication techniques. In the past, experts had worried about divorce because it undermined the authority of parents. This was just what the new advocates of divorce liked about it. The multi-marriage family can be seen, the Courage to Divorce argued, as an extended kinship system that provides relief from the suffocating relationships children often encounter and endure in the intact nuclear system. After all, the children had to learn to live for themselves too. The divorced single mother was no longer the stern guardian of a Puritan morality who so haunted the collective memory of the 1970s. Who first takes our hand away from our genitals? Who implants pleasures or inhibitions about our bodies? Who lays down the rules and with their own life gives us an indelible model? Nancy Friday demanded. She was now a friend to her children, almost a sister, just as she was in the 1977-78 television comedy One Day at a Time, the first regularly scheduled show to feature a divorced family. Divorced or married, the parents of the 1970s found it uncomfortable and awkward to exert authority over their children. The boomers who had been raised on the not exactly stern Dr. Spock turned when their own children arrived to Penelope Leach, an English baby guru whose first book appeared in the United States in 1978. Leach popularized the new child psychology of the era, which held that the word no crushes children's fragile self-esteem. It might seem paradoxical that the same era could at once so indulge and so neglect its children. But is it? Indulgence follows neglect as surely as hangovers follow booze. The parents of the 1970s may have been more obsessive about their children than the parents of earlier times, more determined to buy the right educational toys, more frantic about placing them in the right school, but this sort of obsessiveness flows much more from the parents' own ego than from the need of the child. There was much talk in the 1970s of how male sexual hunger transforms women into objects. Parental obsessiveness can do the same to children. Objects? Some were prepared to venture further still and treat children as commodities. One of the brightest legal minds of the 1970s, Richard Posner of the University of Chicago, a future Reagan appointee to the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals, proposed that the chaotic system of adoption be replaced by the straightforward sale and purchase of children. He was only slightly ahead of his time. 20 years later, the sale and purchase of offspring would become a familiar feature of American life, as sperm banks, egg donors, surrogate mothers, and international adoption enabled those with cash to acquire their dream baby. The fateful step toward this baby market of the future was taken on July 25, 1978, when a healthy 6-pound girl was born in Lancashire, England, the first human being to have been conceived in a petri dish. And that was the Satan's Spawn chapter of the book, How We Got Here, the 70s. Thank you. This is Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States today, wishing or bidding adios to the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there, and reminding you to be courteous, be smart, be beautiful. Actually, be polite, be smart, be beautiful, and remember that the left has no authority and no power, and they can't win.